Okay, so today we're going to go back a little bit and cover the autonomic nervous system. So we kind of skipped over it and did special senses and endocrine first, but now we're going to finish up the nervous system with the autonomic nervous system and a little bit of that visceral sensory. So autonomic nervous system is motor, but we'll also talk a little bit about the visceral sensory as well. So what are we doing today? So we're going to cover the autonomic nervous system, right? So we're going to talk about kind of compare visceral motor and somatic motor. What are the differences? We've kind of already talked about voluntary versus involuntary control, but there's a couple differences, similarities and differences between them as well. And then we'll really spend most of the time talking about the differences between the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So that's going to be, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And then what are the pathways? How do they actually innervate these organs and how does it communicate with the central nervous system? Because the autonomic nervous system is part of our peripheral nervous system. So we have to have some communication back to the central nervous system. So we'll talk about how that communication, those pathways happen. And then, like I said, just a little bit about the visceral sensory. So how do we pick up sensations in our viscera, in our guts, right? So how does that work? We'll touch on that a little bit. And then we'll talk just a little bit about the control by the central nervous system of the autonomic nervous system. So because it's part of the peripheral nervous system, that central nervous system is going to have control over it. And as always, we'll kind of finish up with some disorders and development. So the autonomic nervous system is really a system of motor neurons, right? So we talked about, sensory neurons versus motor neurons. Motor neurons are the ones going away from the central nervous system and innervating glands, muscles, organs, all of these, okay? And so the autonomic nervous system is really the general visceral motor system of the peripheral nervous system. So what do we innervate, right? So since we're involuntary, we're going to be innervating smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, right? So all that, those visceral organs in the body. And they're going to regulate those visceral functions. So heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, urination, all of these, visceral, involuntary functions that our body does. Okay, so we've seen this slide before in class, so it's just showing the difference between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So it's just a reminder that our autonomic nervous system is over here in the peripheral nervous system. So we have our motor division split up into somatic or voluntary motor, and then autonomic or involuntary motor. So that's where we're going to be looking at today, and it can further be divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Then we'll talk a little bit about our visceral sensory as well today to finish that off. So let's compare our somatic motor, which we said is voluntary, to the visceral or involuntary motor, which we call our autonomic nervous system. So if we look at a few differences, we can compare these. So in our voluntary motor, our somatic motor, we were looking at kind of just one motor neuron extending straight from the central nervous system, usually that spinal cord, out to the skeletal muscles. And these guys were very well myelinated. They conduct impulses really rapidly. So we talked about that and myelination and what are the advantages of myelination. So these guys are all myelinated. They only have one motor neuron coming out from the spinal cord. Now, in comparison, our autonomic nervous system, we actually have a chain of two motor neurons. So it's not just one motor neuron, we've got two. And so that means there's going to be a synapse, a connection, a communication between those two motor neurons, and they are going to live in a ganglion. Okay, so that synapse is going to be in a ganglion somewhere outside the central nervous system. So that means we have a preganglionic neuron coming straight from the spinal cord. It's going to synapse in that ganglion with a postganglionic neuron. Okay, so we've got this chain of two motor neurons, and we'll talk a lot more about that, and it'll make a little more sense in a minute. But these guys, these are usually very thinly myelinated or not even myelinated at all. So the conduction is a lot slower than the somatic or voluntary motor system. So, the signal doesn't have to be conducted really rapidly. So we don't care as much if it's myelinated or not. Okay. And where they synapse, we're going to talk about these different ganglions in the autonomic nervous system. So again, don't panic over this slide. It's just showing you some of the differences between our somatic motor innervation, okay, and our autonomic motor, okay, or our visceral motor. So again, don't panic over the slide, but it's just going to kind of break it down a little bit. So we have our differences up here, and then we're actually looking at where those neurons come out of the central nervous system. So in somatic motor, we've got just that one neuron coming out of the spinal cord with that axon, that heavily myelinated axon out to the skeletal muscle. Okay, so no peripheral ganglion, just one neuron coming out, okay, well myelinated. Now, if we talk about the autonomic nervous system, it could be coming up from the brain or the spinal cord. So we've got a couple different regions where these neurons, these preganglionic neurons, are going to be coming out of. And then they're going to synapse, whether that's going to be, closer to the spinal cord or actually out near the organ itself. But it's going to synapse with that postganglionic neuron, because remember, we've got our two motor neurons, our chain of motor neurons. And the color of these axons, this one's kind of a purple, that one's kind of a green. If you look down here, it just kind of shows you the difference in the myelination. So it could be not myelinated or just lightly myelinated versus this heavily myelinated axon over in the somatic motor. Okay, so again, don't panic too much, and we'll go through this individually of the sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Okay. So speaking of sympathetic versus parasympathetic, we're going to divide the entire autonomic nervous system into these two divisions, okay? They are both going to have a chain of two motor neurons, okay? And they innervate mostly the same structure, so the same organs in the body, but they have the complete opposite effects. So if one speeds up the heart rate, the other one slows down the heart rate, okay? So the sympathetic is really involved in extreme situations. So we kind of call it the fight or flight, right? So you're going to have some sort of extreme environment. So excitement, fear, whatever that may be. And then parasympathetic is really going to be the rest and digest. So it just kind of controls all the routine kind of functions of the body, like digestion, urination, things like that. And then this picture on the right just shows you the split between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. If you notice, all these organs are pretty much the same, okay, that they're innervating, but you may have a plus if it stimulates that organ, or a minus if it's going to slow down or inhibit that organ. Okay, and if you notice, it's going to have the opposite effect on the other side, right? So sympathetic speeds up the heart, parasympathetic slows down the heart. So let's just go through them kind of individually. So sympathetic, we said fight or flight. During extreme situations, that could be extreme exercise, extreme excitement, or even emergencies. So kind of think of E for extreme and all those situations that fall under that category. So in response, right, you really want to be able to have an accurate response for the situation. And so usually could be a dangerous situation. So you want to be able to, your body wants to be able to function correctly in that extreme situation. So you're going to give your body the best chance, the best fighting chance it has. So you're going to increase that heart rate and breathing rate, increase blood flow and oxygenation to those skeletal muscles, whereas you may want to decrease blood flow to things that you don't want to be using at that time, such as your intestines or your urinary tract. So you're going to vasoconstrict or, decrease blood flow to those other areas and just send all that blood and oxygen straight to the skeletal muscles because that's what's going to be working. You're going to dilate your pupils, so you're going to be able to see further away. You're going to dilate those bronchioles in the airways in your lungs so that you can increase your respiratory rate, your oxygenation in the lungs. And then overall, you're just going to inhibit probably those digestive functions, those urinary tract functions, because you don't need to be going to the bathroom while you're running away from the tiger, right? Now, opposite, we have the parasympathetic nervous system, so our rest and digest. So we're going to be conserving energy, right? So we're going to lower that heart rate, lower that blood pressure. Respiration is usually low to normal. You should be living in a parasympathetic world, right? You should be kind of just, your body is normally at rest, right? So you have your housekeeping activities, digestion, elimination. So now let's look at the differences between the two divisions. We know they do complete opposite effects, but if we look at the physical neurons of these divisions, we can see some differences. So if we look at our picture to the right over here and just take a look at these different neurons. So we have kind of the blue neurons for the parasympathetic system, and then these green colored neurons for the sympathetic. So if you notice, where do these neurons exit the central nervous system? So that's going to be a difference, okay? So we say originate from or exit those areas, okay? So that's our first difference. If we look at the sympathetic, all these green ones, they're all clumped together, kind of right along the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Okay, so we call this the thoracolumbar division because that's where all those neurons are originating. Versus the parasympathetic, if we look at the blue, it's kind of split. We've got some guys up here kind of in the brain region, and then some down here kind of in the sacral region. So we call it the craniosacral division because that's where those preganglionic fibers are coming from. Okay, so that's one difference. Now, another difference is the length of our second motor neuron. So we call those the postganglionic neurons or postganglionic fibers. So one is where do they originate? And then once they synapse, you're going to have that second motor neuron or that postganglionic neuron, and the length of that fiber or axon is different. So if we look first over at the sympathetic side, these guys are all going to kind of synapse fairly close to the spinal cord, and we'll talk about these sympathetic ganglia in a minute. Some of them are a little further out, but in general, they're fairly close to the spinal cord. So that means that that second neuron, that postganglionic neuron, is quite long. So it has a bit of distance to travel to whatever organ it is innervating. Okay, so that's what we mean by length. So they have long postganglionic fibers. Okay. Whereas if we look over here on the parasympathetic side and we see those synapses on the ganglion, they're super close to the actual organ itself. So that means that that postganglionic fiber is quite short. It doesn't have a very long distance to go to innervate that organ. Okay, so that's the difference between these postganglionic fiber lengths. Sympathetic is long, parasympathetic is short. Now, if we look at some other differences, and these aren't as important in my opinion for this class, but we'll go through them, is how many times do they branch? So if we look at the fibers, and especially if we look over at the sympathetic side, we see some of these kind of branching. Okay, so we've got multiple branches off of these neurons. So we call them highly branched on the sympathetic side. So they can innervate multiple organs at once. So if you notice over here, this one neuron can innervate both the liver and the gallbladder at the same time. Okay, so that means they can stimulate more than one organ all at the same time. So that's pretty common for the sympathetic nervous system. You kind of want an immediate whole body response, right? All at the same time. Whereas parasympathetic, it's very localized. So not very much branching. They're just going to innervate directly to that organ. Okay, so very few branches. Now, when we talk about the synapses, um, what type of neurotransmitter is crossing that synapse is different between the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Usually in the sympathetic, we're talking about norepinephrine as being the neurotransmitter, which is a little different than the parasympathetic system, which is usually acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is kind of our classic neurotransmitter. You know, usually we talk about acetylcholine as our main neurotransmitter. So sympathetic is a little different because it uses a different type of neurotransmitter. But again, don't worry too much about that for this class. So let's start with the parasympathetic division. So first we're going to talk about where those preganglionic neurons are coming from the central nervous system. So our cranial outflow is all coming from the brain. So mostly that brain stem, and they follow the tracks of the cranial nerves, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But essentially these guys are the big players, this cranial outflow. These guys are going to be innervating all the organs in the head, neck, thorax, and abdomen. So the picture continues over here, and these guys still are coming out to all of these organs in the abdomen, the stomach, the intestines, the pancreas, all those guys. So the cranial outflow really covers the majority of the organs. And then the sacral outflow, we have this of just a couple of them coming out of the sacral region. And these guys are innervating kind of the pelvic organs. So think reproductive organs, urinary tract, and a little bit of the lower intestines. Okay. So let's look at that cranial outflow first, because we know this is kind of our big players, okay? And these preganglionic fibers are really going to run with those cranial nerves. So they're going to exit the brain kind of the same way those cranial nerves did. So these are our cranial nerves that they're actually kind of following. So cranial nerve 3, our oculomotor nerve coming out, facial nerve, okay, cranial nerve 7 coming out, glossopharyngeal 9, and vagus. We said vagus was our big player in the autonomic nervous system because it is really responsible for all these parasympathetic responses of the entire body, which is pretty crazy. So these cell bodies are located in the gray matter of the brainstem. Okay, so that makes sense, right? The cell bodies have to live in the gray matter of the central nervous system. branches. So if we look specifically at the pathway of that vagus nerve, we said it's one of the few parasympathetic neurons that branches. So we do have quite a few branches in the body, right? It's going out to all these different organs. We're going to create some nerve plexuses. And remember when we talked about the nerve plexuses of our nerves going out to our limbs, right? Our brachial plexus, the lumbosacral plexus. So it's just a group of nerves, kind of a bundle of nerves is just a nerve plexus, okay? So what are these different plexuses created by the vagus nerve? Well, we have the cardiac and pulmonary plexuses. So these guys are going to be right near the heart and lungs. Okay, so it's going to have this plexus send out these branches right out to the heart and the lung into those intramural ganglia, plural, right? And then it's going to have a celiac plexus. So essentially, kind of celiac has to do with the stomach. So it's going to be near the stomach, but it's going to send out some branches out to the liver, the gallbladder, the stomach, the pancreas, all these kind of digestive organs, okay? And then our last plexus that it creates is the superior mesenteric plexus, but don't get too caught up in the mesenteric plexus just yet. It's named for the mesenteric artery that goes to your intestines. So essentially it's just going to the superior part of those intestines. Okay, so kind of up near the stomach. Stomach sits right here, and then all these little intramural ganglia within the intestines themselves. Okay. So we just covered all the cranial outflow. The cranial outflow, all of these neurons are following those cranial nerve pathways, right? So they're going out the same places as those cranial nerves. They're hitching a ride with the cranial nerve. But our sacral outflow is a little bit different. So the neurons are going to come out of the sacral region. So remember, our spinal cord does end up in the lumbar region, but essentially these nerves and neurons are going to exit in a certain region. So just keep in mind about that. So even though we call it the sacral region, it's really, this is where that neuron is exiting the spinal cord, not where it originates up in that lumbar area. So anyways, the sacral outflow, think the pelvic organs and the lower abdomen, okay? So these guys are all going to run kind of together, and we call them the pelvic splanchnic nerves. But again, don't get too caught up on that. They're going to kind of go through another plexus, okay? So the hypogastric plexus is the one that these guys go through, and then they're going to individually go out to those pelvic organs, those reproductive organs, urinary system organs, and a little bit up to the digestive tract as well. Okay. So it's just finishing off these lower region organs. Okay. But don't get caught up too much about these splanchnic nerves. Just know they're going to go through a plexus as well, and then they're going to synapse on these intramural ganglia also within the organs. All right, so now let's talk about the sympathetic division. So it's quite different from the parasympathetic division. Not only does it do the opposite effects of the parasympathetic division, but the structure of these chains of neurons are a little bit different as well. So remember in the beginning we were saying all of these guys originate from kind of the thoracic and lumbar spine. So we call it the thoracolumbar division because all those preganglionic neurons are coming from the thorax and the lumbar region of the spine. So these guys are all coming from that lateral horn. We didn't talk too much about the lateral horn. It's kind of right next to that anterior horn, but we said this area was all the motor neurons coming out, right? So all the motor neurons are going to be going through that anterior root, okay, and going out and away from the central nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is going to not only supply all of the visceral organs, same as the parasympathetic division, right? They're innervating all those same organs, but having an opposite effect. But one of the big differences is the sympathetic division also innervates some superficial body regions, so some regions of the integumentary system. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that is a difference from the parasympathetic nervous system. We also have more ganglia in the sympathetic nervous system. So we talked about kind of those intramural ganglia that are within kind of the organs themselves or very close to them. We're going to have a lot more ganglia in the sympathetic nervous system. So we're going to go through those ganglia. So the first group of ganglia are the sympathetic trunk ganglia. These guys have a couple different names. They're also referred to as the chain ganglia because they're kind of in a chain along the spinal cord or column right outside the vertebrae. So they're also called the paravertebral ganglia, para meaning next to the vertebrae. So again, these chain ganglia, sympathetic trunk ganglia, however you want to remember it, is fine with me. So these guys are on either side of the vertebral column. So they run up and down the length of the vertebral column on either side. And they're connected. So these are the ganglia are the little enlargements, right? And then the sympathetic trunk is what is going to connect the ganglia together, okay? So there's these short little nerves that connect them. And they come off and join the ventral ramus. So these guys come off that ventral ramus via the rami communicans. And don't worry too much about the gray versus the white. Just know that that's the rami communicans. And a lot of you guys appreciated these in lab on the model, but I said we didn't need to identify them in lab. But now we're going to learn what they actually are. Okay. So the other group of ganglia are the collateral ganglia. So if we look at our picture, you can kind of identify the chain ganglia fairly well. So they're all lined up and down the vertebrae, and they're very much in line on either side, and that is the sympathetic trunk ganglia. Okay, so those guys are easy to identify. They're paired, they run up and down the spine. Now the collateral ganglia are a little bit different. They're unpaired, so they're just kind of randomly arranged in the abdomen. You don't find them in the thoracic cavity. They're only in the abdomen and the pelvis. So these different collateral ganglia, don't worry too much about the different names. They run and they run in the same areas as the plexuses that we talked about in the parasympathetic nervous system. So remember we had those plexuses that were just the network of nerves, and so this is the same thing. It's just a ganglia that's kind of near or in that plexus. Okay. So essentially the fibers are going to bypass the sympathetic trunk, okay? So they're not going to synapse in those sympathetic trunk ganglia. They're going to bypass them and essentially run with the parasympathetic nerve, which is the vagus nerve, some branch of the vagus nerve, and they're going to synapse in these ganglia, okay? These collateral ganglia. So I know that that can be kind of confusing, so let me know if you don't understand what these collateral ganglia are, and we'll go through them a little bit more. So now we know we have sympathetic trunk ganglia and collateral ganglia. So two different types of ganglia that these preganglionic neurons can synapse on, because we said we had a chain of two motor neurons, right? So we have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. So if we follow this, we can follow our preganglionic neuron out of the spinal column and through that ventral or anterior root. And then it's going to join up and become a spinal nerve. And then it's going to go out the ventral ramus and go through that communicans, that rami communicans, and then it's going to go into the sympathetic trunk ganglion. So now we have a couple of options, okay? So we're going to do one of three things. So what is our first option? Okay, so our first option is just like this picture here. We can synapse on or in this ganglion, this sympathetic trunk ganglion, so at the level that we exit. And then that postganglionic neuron is just going to exit back out the communicans and on its way out the spinal nerve. Okay, so that is one option. We kind of enter and exit the sympathetic trunk ganglion at the same level, and we're going to synapse in that ganglion. Okay, but what are our other options? Our second option is that the axon can either ascend or descend, meaning it can go up or down that sympathetic trunk ganglion. And we'll talk about why it may want to do this. So here's our top picture. So the beginning starts the same way. We exit out that anterior root. We go through that ventral or anterior ramus, and then we're, instead of synapsing at this first ganglion, we're going to go up and we're going to synapse at a higher ganglion, and then that postganglionic neuron is going to exit at a different level, so at a higher level or lower level, just depends on if it's going up or down. Okay. Now our third option, again, we start out the same way. We're going to exit. We're going to go through the ventral ramus, out through the rami communicans, and then we're not going to synapse in that sympathetic trunk ganglion at all. We're just going to bypass it, and we're going to go out on a splanchnic nerve. Again, don't worry too much about splanchnic nerve. Just know it's associated with the parasympathetic nervous system, so it's going to kind of hitch a ride with one of the branches of the vagus nerve. And then it's going to synapse in one of those collateral ganglia that we talked about. So this is really just for the abdomen, the pelvic cavity. Okay, this is the only time it's going to bypass that sympathetic trunk ganglion and go out to one of these collateral ganglion. And then that postganglionic fiber is going to go out to a target organ, right? And whether that may be the intestines or the reproductive or urinary systems. So now remember we said the sympathetic nervous system goes out to some superficial or peripheral structures in the body. So it does actually innervate some sweat glands, the erector pili muscles, remember the one that makes your hair stand on end, and peripheral blood vessels. So the parasympathetic nervous system does not innervate the body periphery, only the sympathetic nervous system. Well, think about it. If you're really scared, your hair might stand on end, you get a little flush, sweaty. So this is all due to the sympathetic nervous system. Okay. So don't worry too much about this, but essentially it's just showing how those fibers get out to the body periphery. So they're either going to synapse at the same level if they're going out to the skin at that level. But remember, we're in the thoracolumbar region. So what about, up on your face or down towards your legs? You may have to go up or down in that sympathetic trunk ganglion to a higher or lower level to be able to reach the body periphery that you need to get to. So this is where this does happen. Okay. So don't panic about this picture. It just kind of puts it all together, what we were just talking about. So this is showing our spinal column, right? And we're all originating in that thoracolumbar region. Okay, so these are all our preganglionic neurons. And now they're going to go out and they possibly will synapse in that chain ganglia. This is the sympathetic trunk ganglia right here. So they're going to either synapse right there, or they may go up or down depending on what region they are at. Okay. And then they may just bypass it altogether and go out to these collateral ganglia. So we talked about the abdomen and pelvic organs being innervated by those neurons that are going to bypass the sympathetic trunk and go out and synapse in those collateral ganglia. Okay? So let's take a closer look at that last picture kind of broken up. So if we look at these specific pathways of the sympathetic nervous system, we'll see kind of how those neurons get to the different regions of the body. So if we're talking about the head, right, we're going to have to kind of go up that sympathetic trunk ganglion because, if we start in the thoracic region, we have to get up into the cervical region. Okay, so these guys are going to ascend and go up into that cervical ganglion, they call it, because it's in that region, but it's all part of the sympathetic trunk ganglion. And then those postganglionic fibers are going to run with some large arteries, essentially out to the peripheral system, the blood in the skin, those erector pillae muscles, the sweat glands. They're going out to the eye, lacrimal glands, all those guys, okay? So now let's talk about the pathways to the thoracic organs. So we covered the head, so we have to kind of go up into the cervical ganglion, the cervical region, to be able to get to the head. Now we're going to talk about how do we get to those thoracic organs. So we're starting in the thoracic region already. So a lot of these fibers are just going to synapse in the nearest sympathetic trunk ganglion, so they don't have to move any direction. And these guys, so there aren't as many plexuses in the sympathetic system. There's a lot more in the parasympathetic. But we do see these cardiac and pulmonary plexuses. So these guys are a group of neurons coming together to create just a couple of neurons coming out. So essentially we want to be able to stimulate the heart and lungs together. So so then you get a simultaneous response, right? So you're going to increase heart rate, dilate blood vessels, increase the heart muscle, the glands, all of that at the same time in the heart and the lungs. So you want to dilate those bronchioles, getting as much oxygenation as possible, okay? But at the same time, you're going to inhibit some of the digestive organs in this region, such as the esophagus running through the thorax. So if we're talking about the pathways of the sympathetic fibers to the abdominal organs, these guys are the ones that are going to pass through the sympathetic chain ganglion, and then they're going to travel through to those collateral ganglion. So they are going to synapse in these different collateral ganglia that are associated with those parasympathetic plexuses, right? So we said there are those groups of neurons in the parasympathetic nervous system in those plexuses, and they are going to synapse in that same area, and they have the same names as the plexuses. But again, like I said, don't get too caught up on these different names of the ganglia. Just know that they're all considered collateral ganglia, okay? And then those postganglionic fibers are going to exit those collateral ganglia and go out to the different organs. So these are our abdominal organs, our pelvic organs, not quite the pelvic organs, the abdominal organs. And these guys are mostly going to inhibit the activity of most of these organs because a lot of these are digestive organs, a lot of housekeeping organs. So most of these guys are going to be inhibitory. And last but not least, the pathways to the pelvic organs. So these guys are going to have to descend the sympathetic trunk. And some of them are going to synapse on the sympathetic trunk ganglia right here as well. And then they're going to send out those post-ganglionic fibers out to the organs in the pelvic region, okay? So some of them are going to bypass the sympathetic trunk ganglion, but some are going to synapse. So again, don't worry too much about which ones are going to pass through and which ones are going to synapse in the trunk, okay? Just know these guys are going out to those pelvic organs, okay? So now in the last lecture, our endocrine lecture, we talked all about the adrenal gland and specifically the adrenal medulla and how it has a huge role in the sympathetic nervous system. Well, now we're going to find out what it actually does and how is it connected to the sympathetic nervous system. So those preganglionic neurons are going to just bypass our chain, our sympathetic trunk, and they are going to go straight to the adrenal medulla. So essentially, the adrenal medulla is a ganglia, okay? So you can think of it like the largest sympathetic ganglia, okay? So it's just going to talk directly to that preganglionic fiber. And so that preganglionic fiber is going to stimulate the secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And epinephrine is the same as adrenaline. So it's kind of that life-saving drug, you think of it, right? So it's going to increase your heart rate, your respiration. It's going to essentially increase the sympathetic response, right, to try to save your life, okay? So it's directly related to the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal medulla is directly connected. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the visceral sensory. So we've been talking about the visceral motor for the autonomic nervous system. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the visceral sensory. We talked a little bit about the special visceral sensory with taste and smell, but now we're going to talk about general visceral sensory. So these guys are going to be picking up stretch, temperature changes, chemical changes specifically, definitely, and irritation. So we talked about all sensory going through that dorsal root, right? That posterior root and that ganglion. So these guys are the same way. They're going through that posterior root ganglion, okay? So there are two cranial nerves that contain these general visceral sensory fibers, and that's cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, and 10, the vagus. So the vagus makes sense. It's down there, right? So it's the one doing majority of the visceral sensory. But the glossopharyngeal does have some up in the neck region. So what is considered visceral pain? So when you cut your arm, right, or cut your muscle, anything in that somatic area, you can feel pain, right, from the cutting. Well, visceral pain is very different. You don't actually feel pain when your organs are cut. So surgical pain, you don't actually feel that, which is quite interesting. Visceral pain really comes from chemical irritation and inflammation. So when your bowels stretch too as well, so anything that's going to cause irritation or inflammation in the organs, you're going to be able to feel that. And the other weird thing about visceral pain is it's actually can be perceived as somatic pain, like my arm hurts or my neck hurts. So you feel like it's somatic in origin, either skin or voluntary muscle, whatever that may be, but it's actually coming from your visceral organs, and that's called referred pain. So you definitely see this with heart attacks, people that feel numbness and pain in their left arm when it's actually their heart, right? So over on this picture, you can see some areas that we actually feel referred pain, but it's in a very different region of the body than the actual organ. Kidneys is very interesting. Lots of referred pain all in the lower abdomen and even the limbs. Like I said, that heart can travel down your arm, up your neck, so can be very weird. I had my gallbladder out and they said you may get some weird pain in your right shoulder. And for sure I did. It was very, very weird. So it's weird. You get this pain in your shoulder, but it's coming all the way down from your gallbladder. So when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, right, we're talking about involuntary motor. So something has to be controlling it. We aren't maybe consciously controlling it, but subconsciously we are. So there is control of the autonomic nervous system by the central nervous system. So what are these areas in the central nervous system that are controlling the autonomic nervous system? So the cerebral cortex, and we're going to go through these individually as well, but the cerebral cortex and the limbic system does have some control, and in the limbic system is quite interesting. You can somewhat get some voluntary control of the autonomic nervous system via the limbic system, so we'll talk about that. But our big player is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is really the boss, the overall boss of the autonomic nervous system. It's also the boss of the endocrine system too. So the hypothalamus has a big role in both the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. And then a little less so. The brainstem definitely has a lot of control. We talked about that reticular formation center, those nuclei that have to do kind of with blood flow, heart rate, things like that. We'll talk a little bit more about the brainstem. And then the spinal cord really is for reflexes. So urination, erection, defecation, a lot of these reflexes are just through the spinal cord. It doesn't even reach up into the brain. Okay. So control by the brainstem and the spinal cord. Let's kind of work our way, up from the bottom. Okay. So the brainstem can control quite a few things. Pupil size, your heart rate, it kind of sets your rate. blood pressure, blood flow, airflow, salivation. So some of these things, it through that reticular formation, those nuclei that are kind of all together have these functions. And then again, like I said, the spinal cord is really for reflexes, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about these reflexes in the other lectures in the urinary and reproductive systems and GI. So the reticular formation is really the part of the brainstem, those nuclei in the brainstem that are influencing the autonomic nervous system. So as we said, the hypothalamus is really our main player. It is the main integration center for the autonomic nervous system. So it really has control over both the sympathetic and parasympathetic functions, and it tells them what to do. Now the limbic system is really interesting. We said that the limbic system is really our area for memory and emotions. It's one of our 3 multimodal association areas, so it's bringing in all that information from the cerebral cortex and creating these memories and emotions. So it's really a subconscious communication with the autonomic nervous system. So say, this is where kind of PTSD comes from. You eat something really bad and you had a visceral reaction to it, or a very scary event. Well, you can recall that very scary event, say, and you can actually cause a sympathetic response. So it's somewhat of a voluntary control if you kind of have these deep memories and can recall that and create a sympathetic response. So it's quite interesting how you do have some voluntary control there. Now, if we talk about the cerebral cortex, that's really, the higher functioning part of our brain. And we can exert some control over the autonomic nervous system via the cerebral cortex. So this is kind of how, meditation works. So you can kind of put yourself into a feeling of calm and try to create the parasympathetic response centers and kind of influence the hypothalamus into a parasympathetic state. The other way you have voluntary control, to a certain extent, you can stall the visceral reflexes, specifically defecation and urination. So it would just be bad if we just had a reflexive response whenever we had to defecate and urinate, right? So we do have some voluntary control to a certain extent over some of those reflexes, which is a good thing. So there are some disorders of the autonomic nervous system that we can talk about. I actually have Raynaud's phenomenon. I don't know if any of you guys notice that sometimes my hands are kind of white or purple. And essentially it's a hyperactivation of the sympathetic nervous system. So it's characterized by a constriction of your peripheral blood vessels. So it can be in response to either cold, emotional stress, anything like that can trigger it. And you just get this, you get a low blood supply to your hands and feet. Another one is Hirschsprung's disease or congenital megacolon. So this is a birth defect in the parasympathetic innervation to the large intestine, specifically the distal large intestine. So feces and gas can accumulate proximal to the defect. So essentially the wall of the intestine doesn't work correctly. That smooth muscle in the wall of the intestine doesn't contract correctly, and so it doesn't push the feces and the gas through the intestines correctly. Okay, so you get this megacolon or this distension of the colon. So when we talk about the development of the autonomic nervous system, we kind of go back to the idea of this neural tube. So the neural tube is going to become the spinal cord. We talked about those neural crest cells, and they're going to become that posterior or dorsal root ganglion, and that's why those cell bodies are outside. So now we're going to talk about a little bit how the other ganglia form in the autonomic nervous system. So the preganglionic neurons are going to develop from that neural tube, right? So they're all going to start in the spinal cord. But the postganglionic neurons are going to develop from this neural crest as well. So just like our sensory neurons, they're going to develop from those neural crest cells. And more specifically, we said the sympathetic division has a lot of ganglia. So it has sympathetic trunk ganglia, and it also has collateral ganglia. So how do those guys get from, right outside the spinal cord, like our dorsal root ganglion, to, anywhere in the abdomen? Well, those cells actually migrate. So the cells from the neural crest are going to migrate ventrally or down anteriorly, and some of them become the sympathetic trunk ganglion. So they're still kind of close to the spinal cord, but not as close as the dorsal root ganglion. And then some of them are going to continue as well and become the collateral ganglia. So they're going to be in the abdomen even further away. Okay. So, over time, the autonomic nervous system, the efficiency of it definitely declines with age. You don't have as great of a sympathetic response. So, and sometimes the parasympathetic innervation, especially to intestines, things like that, the GI tract just doesn't work quite as well in older people. So you definitely see an overall decline with age. So here's the list of learning objectives for the lecture. Definitely go through these guys. Make sure you go back through the lecture and understand each of these objectives. Make yourself a study guide with the notes. This is a shorter lecture, which is great since we have the exam coming up. So this is the end of the nervous system and endocrine system material. So we will have our exam on Tuesday, March 31st, as per that new schedule I sent out. And it will be an online exam, and I'll tell you guys more about the specifics of the online exam this next week. So I will keep you posted on that. The lecture exam will cover chapters 12 through 17, the nervous system and the endocrine system. So we're going to test out Confer-Zoom next week as well, which is what I posted about. And we'll let you know how that goes. We'll do a test run, and then we're going to try to do a review for the exam on Friday. So hopefully that goes well. I'll give you guys extra credit if we do the review, and that'll be a good motivator to try to figure out how to get Confer-Zoom working. But if we don't get Confer-Zoom working, and regardless, I've posted our normal review questions on Canvas for each of those chapters, or at least most of the chapters and most of the sections. And then we'll have our lecture quiz due Monday as well, and I'll post more about that, just our regular lecture quiz that we normally do. So until next time, good luck with everything. Hope you guys are staying healthy.